Welcome to Train Signal. This is the Planning a Forefront TMG Deployment lesson in the Forefront Threat Management Gateway 2010 training course. We'll kick off this lesson with a look at the various roles that are available in a TMG deployment. We'll then look at the software and hardware requirements that are necessary to support TMG, and we'll talk about some things you need to keep in mind when deploying TMG to virtual machines. Next, we'll discuss the various Threat Management Gateway network topology options you have at your disposal, and talk about a couple of differences between workgroup and domain deployments. Then we'll move on to a discussion about how DNS and TMG go hand in hand, and we'll wrap up the lesson with a discussion about Threat Management Gateway security roles and permissions. The people in charge at Global Mantic have a deep understanding that the planning phase of any project is the most critical. Because Threat Management Gateway plays such a pivotal role at the edge of the network for Global Mantic, and downtime cannot be a result, planning is required to make sure that everything goes as planned. By the end of this lesson, you'll understand the hardware and software requirements that are necessary to support TMG, and you'll be aware of guidance that's related to deploying TMG into a virtual environment. You'll be able to place the Threat Management Gateway server at the appropriate location in the network infrastructure, and you'll be able to decide on the security options that are necessary during the planning process. There are basically three what I call roles that are available in TMG. These are also just components that can be installed together or separately depending on the needs of the organization, and really it's frankly dictated by the size of the organization. The most primary role and the most critical role, and the one you've really got to have, is that of the TMG server itself. This is the one that includes all of the firewall and other security features such as proxy server, network inspection system, so on and so forth. Without this role, you've got nothing. You don't have your firewall, you don't really have that device at the edge of your network protecting the organization. Next, for larger organizations that have multiple TMG servers, there's the Enterprise Management Server. This provides the ability to centrally manage arrays of Threat Management Gateway servers rather than having to manage individual systems from each individual console. Speaking of management, we also have the TMG Management Tool. This is the Threat Management Gateway console itself. This is the location from which you'll perform just about all of your Threat Management Gateway configuration. Global Mantic will not use an Enterprise Management Server, but it will use a single server for the Threat Management Gateway and Threat Management Gateway management tools. As you might expect from a tool such as Threat Management Gateway, there are certain software requirements that you have to meet before you can continue on with the installation of the product. Most importantly, Threat Management Gateway server cannot be installed onto a writable domain controller. This is a serious security issue if this was allowed. You really don't want to put a writable domain controller at the very edge of your network, regardless of how well it's being protected. You can, however, install Threat Management Gateway onto a read-only domain controller, such as those found at branch offices. On the operating system side of the house, you can install Threat Management Gateway to Windows Server 2008 with Service Pack 2, the 64-bit edition, Windows Server 2008 R2, and the standard enterprise and data center editions of these products are supported. For the management software itself, you can install the Threat Management Gateway Management Console to a 32 or 64-bit computer that, as long as it has 1 gig of RAM or more, and is running Windows Server 2008 R2, Windows Server 2008 SP2, Windows 7, or Windows Vista with Service Pack 1. Before you install TMG 2010, there's a few things you should do. 1. Make sure you're at the latest service pack for Windows Server. That's kind of obvious. You want to make sure you have all the latest updates to your server, particularly for servers you're going to deploy at the very edge of your network. That said, make sure all your patches are also installed. So once you install the service pack for your machine, run a Windows update to make sure you've got the latest patches installed. And one of the really nice things about TMG 2010 is that's all you've really got to do. As part of the installation process, the Threat Management Gateway installer will install the rest of the prerequisites on its own. It'll install the roles that are necessary, and it'll also install all the other updates that are necessary in order for TMG to operate. There is no need to install these prerequisites manually outside the installation process. For Global Mantic, that's how we're going to approach the installation process. We're going to allow the Threat Management Gateway system to install all the prerequisites on its own. As far as hardware goes, because Threat Management Gateway is a 64-bit only piece of software, you have to run on a 64-bit capable processor, which is dual core or better. For the medium business edition of the software, you need at least 1 gig of RAM on the server, and for standard and enterprise, Microsoft recommends a minimum of 2 gigabytes with a recommended usage of at least 4 gigabytes. For disk space, the medium business edition requires 150 megabytes, while the standard and enterprise editions need 2.5 gigs of space for the installation itself. That's just for the base TMG product. If you need other features, such as the proxy server, you're going to need more disk space. We're going to be discussing disk space needs in those lessons as they come up, but their safest bet is to install Threat Management Gateway onto a system that has a couple of hundred gigs at least of space if you're going to want to use all of these other features. And you need network adapters, and possibly lots of them. You need at least an adapter for the internal network. So the internal network is the one to which you're going to always be connected, no matter what. You then need additional network adapters, which are dependent on how many networks are connected to your Threat Management Gateway server. If you're installing just an internal and an external network, 2 network adapters will suffice. If you're planning to have a DMZ or a demilitarized zone or a perimeter network in your environment, you'll need an additional network adapter or 3 network adapters. If you have 2 perimeter networks, you'll need 4 network adapters, so on and so forth. Any production hardware that you need beyond the limits or the requirements that are discussed here are going to be dictated by the load and the services in use. As an example, I've listed here the Secure Web Gateway for 1,500 users as per Microsoft documentation. Microsoft, for this particular installation, recommends the minimum of a quad-core CPU and 8 gigs of RAM. So what that means is your actual use is going to really be dictated by the kind of hardware you throw at the situation. So if you throw too little hardware, you may not be able to support as many users as you need. Microsoft has very good documentation on the needs for hardware based on certain usage scenarios, and there's a link to that later in this lesson. Here are some other hardware considerations to keep in mind. If you're planning to install a Threat Management Gateway server supporting anywhere up to 500 users, 250 gigs of disk space is generally sufficient for TMG logging needs and caching requirements if you put that in place. If you go beyond 500 users, you really do need to consult Microsoft's hardware recommendations to determine what your actual need is going to be. For Global Mantics, we're going to install all services onto a single server that has 4 gigs of RAM assigned, 250 gigs of disk space allocated, and 2 processing cores, or 2 CPUs, and 2 processing cores, or 2 CPUs. This will be installed into a virtual machine, so we're going to install 2 cores that will appear as 2 CPUs to the virtual machine. Speaking of virtual machines, Threat Management Gateway is supported in a virtual environment, which might surprise you to a point, given the fact that this sits at the edge of the network. However, you have to make sure the hypervisor you use is supported by Microsoft, and Microsoft is pretty strict about their hypervisor support. In general, Hyper-V and vSphere, among others, are good to go when it comes to a support standpoint on these kinds of pieces of software. If you try to run Threat Management Gateway on unsupported software and then you call Microsoft support for assistance, they will ask you to either replicate the problem inside supported software or on real hardware before they'll give you some assistance. You've got to make sure your virtual machine has enough virtual network adapters, RAM, and processing power to support your network environment. Just because you're running inside a virtual machine doesn't mean you can necessarily skimp on the required resources. VLAN configuration in a virtual machine might be tricky, and network and systems teams will need to be well coordinated when you deploy the Threat Management Gateway in this kind of scenario. Global Mantics as a company will be deploying to physical hardware to keep Threat Management Gateway separate from other devices. For my lab use, I'm going to use Hyper-V as explained in the lab setup lesson earlier in this course. If you're confused about how I'm configured inside my environment here in Hyper-V, please refer back to the lab setup lesson, as all of it's going to be explained there in good detail for how I've set up Threat Management Gateway, my virtual network adapters, and resources to support the Threat Management Gateway implementation. There are a number of different ways by which you can deploy Threat Management Gateway, and we're going to talk about a few of them here. These are the Threat Management Gateway network topologies that you have to choose from when you do your implementation of TMG. The first is really the most common, and it's called the Edge Firewall topology. This allows Threat Management Gateway to be the organization's edge firewall, and it's connected to two networks: the internal network that you see here down at the lower part of your screen, and the external network, the cloud, the internet, whatever you want to call it. This requires the Threat Management Gateway, the firewall component, to have two network adapters at its disposal. Next, we have the three-leg perimeter network, which implements Threat Management Gateway with a perimeter network. You'll notice that it looks very familiar if you saw the picture on the previous slide, but we've added a perimeter cloud here. Generally, what's going to happen here is you're going to have your clients on the internal network, along with any servers that are strictly internal, such as potentially internal domain servers, DNS servers, domain controllers, and the like. In the perimeter network, you'll put your servers that require external access from the external world: web servers, FTP servers, mail servers, front-end mail servers, and the like. Obviously, depending on what you deploy to your perimeter network, there could be a lot of communication taking place between the internal and the perimeter network. Next, we have the back or front firewall topology. It's called the back firewall in Threat Management Gateway. This is where Threat Management Gateway sits either behind or in front of another firewall. So on your diagram, you'll notice that there's two firewalls, and I've got Threat Management Gateway listed as both of them. Well, in this case, probably only one of them would be Threat Management Gateway, although they both could be. But it would be a different firewall product. If I were deploying this in my day-to-day work environment, we have a sonic wall firewall that sits at the front of our network between the internet connection and our network. I would deploy a Threat Management Gateway server, for example, behind a perimeter network in this case, so that I would have two firewalls through which my users had to traverse in order to get out to the internet. This kind of topology is useful if you have another firewall already and you want to keep it in place, but you'd like to establish a perimeter network without having to go through a whole lot of trouble to reconfigure the other firewall for the perimeter access. We then have a single network adapter topology, which has some limiting factors. We won't be deploying this for GlobalMantics, but this is where Threat Management Gateway is connected to one network only, the internal network. It can also be connected to the perimeter network or some other network, but this is useful when you have another firewall on your network edge and you have TMG serving one or a few functions. Some of TMG functions will not work in a single network adapter topology. I've mentioned elsewhere in this course that Threat Management Gateway can be deployed into either a workgroup or into an Active Directory domain join server. There are some things to keep in mind when you're deploying to a non-domain system or a workgroup system. First of all, the Enterprise Management System Replication Service is unavailable in a workgroup environment. And there are some additional preparation steps you have to take to prepare your workgroup environment to make sure that everything works as expected, including making sure that Active Directory accounts and things are synchronized. You have to make sure that the accounts from the domain are mirrored and, as I mentioned, synchronized on your Threat Management Gateway workgroup system in order for policies to be able to work appropriately. The Threat Management Gateway server system requires a server certificate when it's operating in a workgroup mode. However, a workgroup can be more secure than a domain deployment since Active Directory is separated from the equation. GlobalMantics will deploy Threat Management Gateway as a part of the GlobalMantics domain. The Threat Management Gateway server will be joined to the globalmantics.com domain, not in a workgroup environment. When it comes to Threat Management Gateway and domain name system or DNS, there's a lot of things to keep in mind. First of all, Threat Management Gateway is very heavily dependent on a properly functioning DNS environment. An underpowered DNS server can create a major performance bottleneck for Threat Management Gateway. In fact, if you look at Threat Management Gateway resources, forums, things like that, a lot of times people say, have you checked your DNS environment to make sure that it's all set up right? And a lot of times that's the problem. If you have a Threat Management Gateway server that has multiple network adapters, in almost every case with only a few exceptions, they will have multiple network adapters, you should configure DNS on only a single adapter. Try to use internal DNS servers, which in turn will have their own recursion and forwarding mechanisms configured. Don't try to have the Threat Management Gateway server handle recursion and forwarding of DNS requests. Assume that your internal DNS servers will be up and functional when Threat Management Gateway is operational. DNS servers must be in the same domain as the Threat Management Gateway server or joined to a trusted domain. The network adapter that holds the DNS servers must be the topmost adapter in the Threat Management Gateway network adapters list, which you'll see later on in this course. And again, we're going to look at a lot more to do. You'll see later on in this course. And again, we're going to look at a lot more to do with DNS throughout this course. So I just wanted to make you aware right now that DNS is a very important part of your Threat Management Gateway environment, and we'll be taking a look at it. So if you have any worries about your DNS environment, address them before you deploy Threat Management Gateway. From a security roles perspective, there's 3 roles that are available by default in Threat Management Gateway. We have the Forefront Threat Management Gateway Array Monitoring Auditor, the Array Auditor, and the Array Administrator. The Array Monitoring Auditor can monitor things. They can't do a lot of things as far as administration goes. Specifically, the Array Monitoring Auditor can monitor network activity, but not actual configuration information from the Threat Management Gateway environment. The Array Auditor can perform all of the same monitoring tasks as the Array Monitoring Auditor, including log configuration and alert definition, and they can also view the Forefront Threat Management Gateway configuration itself, so it takes it one step beyond the Array Monitoring Auditor. Then we have the Grand Poobah of administration, the Array Administrator. The users that are assigned to this group can do pretty much anything with regard to Threat Management Gateway administration and configuration and monitoring. For Global Mantics, they're going to use a single administrator account that operates as the Forefront Threat Management Gateway Array Administrator. We're not going to be breaking things down into separate roles for Global Mantics. I'm not going to go into a lot of explained depth and analysis on what you see on this slide because it's easy to read. This basically gives you a list of the various actions that are available in Threat Management Gateway and some of the things you can do. And it shows you what each various security role is allowed to do with regard to that particular action. Now let's summarize the decisions that have been made by Global Mantics as a result of the information gleaned in this lesson. On the hardware side, Global Mantics will deploy Threat Management Gateway to a system that has 4 gigs of RAM, 250 gigs of disk space, and 2 CPUs assigned. The deployment topology selected will be Edge Firewall, which necessitates 2 network adapters, an internal and an external network. The Threat Management Gateway will be intended to protect the internal network from the external network. TMG will be deployed to a domain-joined server rather than to a workgroup environment. And from the administration side, Global Mantics will have a single administrator operating as the Forefront Threat Management Gateway Array Administrator. Basically, we're not going to worry about the other administration roles. We're going to worry about working with Threat Management Gateway and learning how to use it from the administrator perspective. We kicked this lesson off with a discussion about the roles that are available in Threat Management Gateway. Next, we talked about the software requirements, for which there really aren't very many because Threat Management Gateway does such a very good job at installing all the prerequisites for you. TMG has some hardware requirements to which you need to pay attention, and for this course, we're focusing on the need for Global Mantics to be able to use Threat Management Gateway in a less than 500 user deployment. So we're able to worry about just modest RAM and disk space needs. Anything beyond that need to go out to Microsoft for additional help. We looked at a few considerations to keep in mind when deploying to virtual machines. You'll see a little bit of these in action later on in this course because I'm deploying Threat Management Gateway into a virtual machine in my lab. We looked at the 4 Threat Management Gateway network topology options and discussed workgroup versus domain deployment considerations and made sure that you understood the importance of DNS with regard to Threat Management Gateway. We then wrapped up the lesson to make sure you understood the built-in Threat Management Gateway security roles and permissions. Here are a couple of supporting resources. The first one is Forefront Threat Management Gateway 2010 hardware recommendations. If you need to deploy TMG 2010 with beyond 500 users, that link will tell you some things to keep in mind when it comes to supporting a lot of users on TMG. There are lots of security considerations to keep in mind when you're deploying into a virtual machine as well. The second link on your screen will take you to a comprehensive document that explains all the various nuances to do with a virtual deployment of TMG. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.